Welcome to this video. As a follow-up to another video that was done regarding Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich and the Anti-Church, I decided to look at the writings and the messages from Father Gobbi in his Blue Book to see if there was anything in there about the same subject. And there's so many messages in there. Of course, there was something that touched on that subject, and it was in 406 and 407 of his Blue Book. And we'll go through that and we'll discuss those messages in this video. But let us begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So first I'd like to touch upon number 406, which is in June 13th, 1989. And the quotes are very small and very short. So let me start off with this one. Beloved sons, today you are calling to mind my second apparition, which was, of course, Fatima, which took place in the humble Cova de Iria in Fatima on June 13th, 1917. Even as of then, I foretold you that which you are living through in these times. I announced to you the great struggle between me, the woman clothed in the sun, and the huge red dragon, which has brought humanity to live without God, and thus making you victims of sin and vices. And she further goes on to say that this attack of the dragon is also in the interior of the church, and that this was already foretold to you by me at Fatima, when I announced to you that Satan would enter in even to the summit of the church. Now, I don't recall that being mentioned when the Third Secret of Fatima was published in the year 2000. Now, that is consistent with some descriptions from people who have read the Third Secret, and even from some popes. It's also consistent with what was described at La Salette and at Akita, both approved Marian apparitions. And she further goes on to say that the aim is to destroy Christ and his church, building a new idol, namely a false Christ and a false church. And she repeats that phrase in paragraphs 406 and 407 several times, this reference to a false Christ and a false church. But let's reference back to Fatima, and of course, June 13th, 1989, that was the 72nd anniversary of the apparition of Fatima, the second apparition in June 13th, 1917. And it's just one more bit of evidence that tells me that there's text associated with this third secret that was never revealed. And if it's indeed this is the heart of the message, and it also came out in Akita, but if this is the heart of the message, then I can understand, I don't agree with it, but I can understand why the text of the third secret was suppressed. But let's go on to look at how this attack on the faith and on the church occurs from the Blue Book. First, she says, our Blessed Mother says, the attack is to obscure the divine word by emptying it of all its supernatural content, leading in a subtle and diabolical way all into apostasy. Again, that's a reference that we hear regarding the third secret, that it's about apostasy. These attacks on the faith we're all too familiar with. We've all heard them. They go something like this: God has nothing to do with creation. There's no supernatural aspect. It's all part of physical science, the Big Bang, evolution, so forth. And de-emphasis of the miracles of Jesus, even a reluctance to believe them. Also, the resurrection itself. There are those members, as mentioned before on this channel, that members of the church that are members of the church in name only, that do not believe in the resurrection or the real presence, for that matter. The second way our Blessed Mother says that we're experiencing an attack on the faith is through the justification of sin. And the quote, of presenting it no longer as an evil, but as something good and of value. So this is where we see a great evil today, where we see an attempt to use words that seem to denote a good to address something which is evil. In other words, camouflaging sin and evil in a cloak of benevolent words. And a good example would be, we don't wish to not include anyone. So if someone's a heretic, if someone believes in something that's contrary to faith and morals, we'll include them. We'll treat them as equals. But in fact, they don't hold the same faith. And maybe they don't hold any faith at all. We see this also in the current discussion, ongoing discussion regarding the inclusion of people who live in sin and to provide them with a blessing. Of course, the church is already established, as was said in Tre Fontane by our Blessed Mother, to welcome the repentant sinner. And there's already means for a person who even may have tendencies which are sinful, but does not act on them. They still have access to the sacraments of the church. This church is still available to them. There's no need to set up anything new and special. That would only be abused and be used in a manner that would undermine the faith of others and also confuse people regarding what is sinful and what is not. If there are people approaching the church for a blessing who live in sin, they should be directed to the confessional, and that's the appropriate place for them. Now, I understand that there's some weasel words that are being used here, and I'm going to use that term, but to say that there's a difference between blessing people and blessing sin is really to obfuscate the fact that you're blessing people who live in sin. And you can see how that would be abused. I can see right now a situation where a couple, they approach the priest, and the priest says something along the lines of, "Where's the wedding rings? I mean, the blessing of the people rings." And of course, people, casual observers, they would not see any difference at all, between blessing people who live in sin and the blessing of sin. So that's a good example that's occurring today regarding justification of sin under the guise of we want to include everyone. We want to include everyone, but we don't want to confirm people in their sin. Doing so is actually uncharitable towards those who should be corrected and to live in a virtuous life and be directed to living in that manner instead of living in sin. Also, there's a reference by our Blessed Mother regarding the attack on the church. And she refers to the church as one and one only. It is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, founded on Peter. As is Jesus, so too is the church, founded by him who forms his mystical body, the truth, the way, and the life. And the attacks on this church, as our Blessed Mother describes it, the first one is false ecumenism. And that's something we discussed previously in a video that I referenced quite a bit. And you hear it also termed as universalism or a false religious equivalency, where all religions are treated equally. So if all religions are equal, all lead to salvation, then why go to the Catholic Church? It undermines the authority of the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Now, understandably, in the Catechism, it says that all who are baptized are part of the church. Now, there are many who are baptized that are not Roman Catholic, and they want nothing to do with the Catholic Church. But still, that's what the Catechism says. And that's true. They are part of the Catholic Church. But the Catechism also says they're part of the church in an imperfect way. And they're in an imperfect way because they don't adhere to all the faith. They have not just common faith. I mean, there's some things that they have in common with the church, the Catholic Church, but also they have many errors. And those errors are, of course, the source of them being in an imperfect union. The second is attack on the sacrament of the Eucharist. And I want to speak about that a little bit more, but our Blessed Mother says that that the attack is to only give it value as a meal. And the result of that has been obvious. So in 2019, there was a new Pew poll, and they polled Catholics, and of those who identified as Catholics, only 1/3 of Catholics believed in the real presence. Now, these are Catholics that attend church, but not necessarily every week. So to be fair, 5 out of 8 Catholics that go to church every week say that they believe in the real presence, which is not great, but it's much better than 1/3. Now, I'd like to get more statistics on that. I'm probably going to hate to do a video on something that's so negative, but I think that I'm going to do that in the future because commentary on the Pew poll, I find it to be not as good as it should be. So I'd like to get more slicing and dicing of those statistics, if they're available. The third way of attacking the church is a subtle and insidious attack on the Pope. And I'd like to point out that this was written during the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, which our Blessed Mother and these messages refer to as my Pope. I want to talk about that a little bit more as well, but I also want to point out that as we look into paragraph 406, our Blessed Mother says that they will succeed in creating this false church and that most will follow it. And that sentence is really the reason why I'm doing this video, to warn people about this potential. And she pointed to the year 1998. Now, some have said that the messages in the Blue Book have been delayed. And that may be true. And I could see that happening because we see really the breakout of the apostasy, although it's been in works for some time. And if you're familiar with this channel, you've heard me say that it started before Vatican II. The Vatican II was a vehicle for accomplishing some of the aims of those who wish to change the faith and create this new church, this new false church. But also I see that possibly occurring in the synod also could be used as a vehicle, especially a synod that's so broad in its scope. So before I get into discussing that, I think I'd like to touch upon the mention of the Pope, the attack on the Pope. There's a couple of extremes that are out there regarding the papacy itself. And one, there's this hyper-papalism. And two, there's the other side of that, which is the flip side, which is people who are apparently attacking the Pope quite a bit. So I'd like to talk about both a little bit. First, on the hyper-papalism side, what is that? So that is really a very childish view of the papacy, where the Pope is someone who is basically infallible. Everything the Pope says is true. The Pope can do no wrong. The Pope cannot sin almost. It's almost like a deity. And it's actually, unfortunately, it's held by people today. Hopefully not the majority, but it's definitely held by people today because I hear them. The problem with this hyper-papalism is that it's distorting us from what our allegiance needs to be. The prime allegiance for us needs to be Jesus and His church and the teaching, the deposit of faith that's been handed down, not just to one pope, but all the popes. This, unfortunately, is the Protestant view of what they think that Catholics think. They think that we think that the Pope is the church, the Pope is divine, so to speak. And that's not the case. That's not Catholic teaching. That is what Protestants think of us. Now, the other side of the coin are those who wake up every morning and they look for a hole in the Pope's shirt. They're always looking for the Pope to do something wrong and to attack him for it, to say something wrong, do something wrong, or maybe they perceive it to be wrong. And that attack has a personal note to it. So it's not just an attack on an error, but an attack against the Pope personally. That's how it comes out. And I would say to them that they need to understand that the Pope is not the church. The church is much bigger than the Pope. And we've had a long line in history of popes. Some of them have been bad popes. Some of them have been good popes. There have been some that have been steeped in error. They've been morally degenerate, even some of them. Not many, but there's been cases of it. There's been some that have spoken heresy. And I noticed an attempt to whitewash them for a number of reasons, but that's just not true. History says that they have spoken heresy. Now, they cannot speak heresy when they speak ex cathedra. So when they speak ex cathedra, they are speaking infallibly, infallible teaching. Unfortunately, the infallibility aspect is I think, what causes confusion with many Catholics. And they believe that everything is infallible regarding faith and morals, even an off-the-cuff remark to reporters or something mentioned on a flight on an airplane where it's an ad hoc question that's being answered. And that's not an infallible teaching. And of course, people can misspeak. People can not communicate correctly. And also, people can be in error. So, in the chair of St. Peter, they speak infallibly when they're speaking about doctrine, which they deliberately wish to speak infallibly about. A good example would be dogma, such as the Marian Assumption or Immaculate Conception, that was spoken infallibly. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about this, but I don't want to make it a long video. So I would say that these two extremes, and I hope I don't upset too many people, but these two extremes are actually two sides of the same coin. It's a distorted view of papacy, and both can lead other people into error. And I think those who are attacking the Pope, they could create a schism. Another way of doing it is on the other side, hyper-papalists. They could do the same thing, because if there's something being said that they defend, which is obviously not part of teachings of the church or not part of the faith and morals that the church teaches, that can also lead to division. And looking back at some of the historical events that I think can help us today learn more about our current situation, such as the Arian heresy. If we believed that the Pope was infallible back then, we'd all be Arians, because Pope Liberius, he was definitely, or at least seemed to promote Arianism. Now, he may have been under undue influence of the emperor, but for all intents and purposes, if you were aware of what he was speaking back then, you would think he was an Arian, and you would be an Arian if you were to follow him in that era. So another lesson to be learned is in the Western Schism. In the Western Schism, unlike the Arian heresy of the 4th century, this schism was in the 14th century. So the vital interest there is there was a division where we had two popes. And there was a pope in Rome, and there was a pope in Avignon. Pope in Avignon was an anti-pope. Not to get into it too much, but the claimant from Avignon was due to what was perceived as an invalid election in Rome due to a threat of violence against the cardinals who were there. They were threatened with violence if they did not elect an Italian pope. So that may not be an invalid election, but regardless of that, we had two claimants against the papacy. The part of this history, I think, that informs us and helps us today is that there were two saints. They supported the valid pope in Rome, St. Catherine of Siena, St. Bridget of Sweden. And there was another saint, St. Vincent Ferrer. He supported the pope in Avignon. Now, I know some are thinking, oh, well, St. Catherine of Siena, she must have been right. She was a great saint. And we're fortunate, especially in the United States, where we've had a large contribution from our Italian immigrants and their heritage, where they brought that devotion to St. Catherine of Siena with them to the United States. So he or she's well known, and everyone knows St. Catherine of Siena and probably knows some information about her as well. Now, St. Vincent Ferrer is not that well known. However, he was a great saint, and I would say he was probably the greatest saint of his day. Just to put it in perspective, St. Catherine of Siena and St. Bridget, if you take all the miracles that are attributed to both of them, you multiply them by 5, you might begin to approximate the miracles attributed to St. Vincent Ferrer. So the moral of the story here, and what really will help us, is that these were both saints. One was a saint that followed the anti-pope, and others were 2 saints that followed the real pope. But they were both saints. They're all saints. And what that means is your sanctity is not dependent upon the pope. It's not dependent upon your bishop or priest or anyone. Now, would it help greatly if the pope were saintly as well, and the bishop and the priest? Of course it would. But it's not, in the end, dependent upon them. And you could argue that in times when we have a bad pope, and you have a bad bishop, and you have a bad priest in your parish, there may be even more grace for those who really wish to pursue the spiritual life and to pursue sanctity, to help them grow in it, to overcome those obstacles that they live in. The other learning along the same lines that I'd like to convey is we talk about communism as being the great dragon in the apocalypse. And the Soviet Union was the greatest example of that, where they decimated the churches, they outlawed Mass and the priesthood. Still, they're the faithful that maintain their faith, and they had nothing. They had no Mass, they had no church to go to, but yet they retained their faith. Your faith is not dependent upon anyone else but yourself. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the language being used when we talk about this anti-church or the false church, or as Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich referred to it also as the dark church. Some of the language is, I think, not appropriate. So we talk about the church as the synodal church, or as the conciliar church, or as the post-conciliar church. I think that language is divisive, and also it may underlie the intent of someone to actually create a new church. As our Blessed Mother says, there is only one Catholic and Apostolic Church that has her Son as its head. And I mentioned the Synod as an example could be a vehicle, as I believe that the Vatican II was also misused as a vehicle. You know, again, this is a valid council, Vatican II. It's a valid synod. You have the synod comprised by, in an appropriate manner. We've had synods before in the church, not to this extent, but we're in a time of apostasy, and those who wish to misuse it will misuse it. So I'm not going to get into the synod that much. I prefer not to comment on current events, but I will comment upon Marian apparitions and also these warnings about apostasy. So I've heard commentary about this particular synod regarding the fact that there is really no doctrine to it. There's no doctrine being discussed here, no changing of doctrine. The problem I see is not a changing so much of doctrine, although there's people in the synod that are definitely, they're grasping, they're clamoring for some changes that would be contrary to the teachings of the church and contrary to faith and morals. But it does not appear that they won the day, at least not today. But where I see the problem is not so much in doctrine, the problem is in the process. The problem I see is that we're creating a new process, and I have to ask the question, when our Blessed Mother says our church is one holy Catholic apostolic, well, how is a synod apostolic? How does that conform to the teaching of the true magisterium of the church when it's comprised of people who are, besides being lay people, some don't even adhere to the teachings of the church? And it's such a broad mesh of people that I have to question, how is that consistent with being one holy Catholic and apostolic, and consistent with passing down the deposit of the faith and teachings of the true magisterium. But when I say that the problem is the process, the problem is that you don't necessarily need to introduce doctrine changes to get your way. You can introduce practices which undermine the doctrine. And we see that coming out of Vatican II, where there's some misapplication of what came out of Vatican II. And a good example is in the Novus Ordo Mass. So there was practices that were introduced there, which I don't believe was the intent of the church and those who voted on the documents. So what I'm referring to is what we discussed in the Pew poll regarding the belief and disbelief in the real presence of the Eucharist. That was undermined by some of the practices that were instituted coming out of Vatican II. Now, Vatican II, from a doctrinal perspective, didn't change anything regarding the real presence. But in the Mass and the Novus Ordo, which was instituted afterwards, we have these practices that were brought into the church. And one, when the priest comes out, and the priest addresses the people right away and turns his back on the tabernacle. Now, the real presence is the real presence. So if Jesus was standing there himself, should the priest come out and turn his back on the tabernacle and address the people? No, of course not. The message being said there is, that's not God. That's not Jesus. The priest goes behind the altar, and again, the back to the tabernacle. Again, it's the same message. It's not Jesus there. What some churches did is they decided to take the tabernacle and move it to the side. Again, the message, not Jesus. And worse yet, they've taken the host in the tabernacle and moved it to another room, away from the altar. Again, the message is not Jesus. I've been told by someone recently that 80% of communication is body language. So practices have a big impact upon what we believe. And I think the term is, you believe how you worship. So there's no surprise that there's a disbelief in the real presence. There's a reluctance to address it. We know, for example, that the hosts are given out and in hand, and they're taken. Sometimes they're found in pews. I mean, it's not often, but it's enough where anytime, any event of it is a problem and is of a concern. And we know worse yet that the host is taken sometimes by the hand and taken outside the church for whatever reason. We don't know. And whatever reason that is, it's not good. So we know these happenings, but yet there's no effort to do anything about them. And we know about the pew poll, and we know about it not just from the pew poll, but what we hear, what we see regarding the Eucharist as well. And that is one of the reasons why I believe that there's so many Eucharistic miracles today. So Lord Jesus saying, I'm here, I'm present, I'm truly present in my body, blood, soul, and divinity. So this commentary from Father Gobbi's Blue Book, it's not the most uplifting, but it's something we need to know, we need to be aware of. And I'm particularly concerned about the one sentence from our Blessed Mother, that most will follow this false church and that they will succeed in creating it. It seems that we live in a time, and this has been mentioned by popes, it's been mentioned by other Marian apparitions, we live in a time when the church must walk its road to Calvary. And the church is members of the church. They are doubting, like St. Thomas doubted. They're being confused, like St. Peter was confused when our blessed Lord was arrested. And many of the members are betraying the church and betraying Christ, as Judas betrayed him. And this indeed looks like it's the hour of the disciples of Judas. But in the end, there is a prophecy by Marie Julie Johanny that Jesus will resurrect the buried church from the tomb. I want to thank you for joining, and God bless.